If you're looking for a PC that can game, edit, or do whatever you want, you've come to the right place, because in this video we're going to be discussing 3 different PC builds, what they're good for, and how much they cost. So the first PC build that I have here is what I'm going to be calling the 1080p monster. Now this PC is mainly going to be a gaming PC. It's mostly for 1080p gaming at 60 FPS and medium settings. So before we start talking about this PC, I would like to say that all of these builds have been spec'd out on PC Part Picker, and all these prices have been taken from the total, which means that mail-in rebates and discounts are included. So the first component for the 1080p monster is going to be a Ryzen 3 1300X. Now this CPU is a quad-core CPU clocked at 3.5 GHz, and it is also overclockable. Now to get the most out of this CPU and to get the most out of the overclock of this CPU, I included a CRYORIG H7 CPU cooler. Now this CPU cooler is an air cooler. It comes in at about $35, so it's not exactly the best CPU cooler you could get. It's definitely not as good as a water cooler, which we will be discussing later, but this CPU cooler definitely would let you get more out of your CPU and allow you to overclock a little bit. Now the motherboard is going to be an MSI B350 ATX motherboard. It is an AM4 socket motherboard. It comes in at about $61. Now like I said, it's not exactly the best motherboard, but it is cheap and would allow you to overclock a little bit. Now the RAM is something that I have personally bought and used, and I'm very impressed with this brand of RAM. It is Patriot Viper Elite RAM. It is 2400 MHz and it is an 8GB kit, which means it has 2 sticks of 4GB. Now for storage, I chose a Seagate Barracuda 2TB 3.5-inch drive. Now this hard drive operates at 7200 RPM, so it's a pretty good hard drive, but it's not exactly the fastest. I would have included an SSD, but to be honest, I don't see the point of an SSD, and they're also incredibly expensive, so for me personally, I think an SSD isn't worth it, but if you want to include an SSD in this, it would only cost maybe $20 more for a 120GB SSD. Now for the GPU, I went with an EVGA GeForce GTX 1060 3GB. Now this graphics card should let you run all games at 1080p at 60 FPS on medium settings. Now the 3GB of VRAM could become an issue later down the line, but for me personally, I don't see this being a huge issue, mostly because the 1060 is still an excellent 1080p card, and the memory bandwidth is pretty high, so I don't really see the 3GB of VRAM being an issue, but this graphics card should let you play games at 1080p medium settings. So for the case, I chose a COUGAR MX330 ATX case. Now this case is a mid-tower case, and it actually, to me, looks pretty cool. The entire side panel is a window, so you can see into your PC, and if you wanted to buy something like an RGB fan or RGB strips, you totally could, and I think it would look pretty cool in this case. Plus it's a mid-tower case, and I personally like mid-tower cases, mostly because I think that they're the perfect size. I feel like full ATX towers are a little bit too big, and mini ITX towers are a little bit too small, so mid-tower cases are the perfect size for me personally. Now for the power supply, I just went with the Seasonic 520 watt power supply. It's an 80 plus bronze certified CPU, so it's a pretty decent power supply, but it's not exactly the best. Now this PC comes in at $640, so by no means is it really cheap, but I personally think that it's actually a pretty good deal, especially for a 1060 and a Ryzen 3. Now if you wanted to check out this build or you wanted to edit it, I'll leave a link to it in the description below, so if you wanted to check it out or even customize it a little bit, you totally could, and like I said, if you want to check it out, it will be in the description. Now moving on to the next PC is what I'm going to be calling the 1440p monster. Now this PC will give you 1440p performance at about 60 FPS at medium settings once again. Now I think this rig is actually pretty decent for the price of $797, which once again isn't really cheap, but I personally think that it is a really good deal for the graphics card and the CPU that's going to be included with it. So for the CPU, I went with an Intel i5-8400. Now this CPU is a 6-core CPU clocked at 2.8 GHz, but in reality it's actually clocked much higher than that. I don't really know why they said it was clocked at 2.8 GHz, because in reality it kind of isn't, but it also is. It's a really complicated CPU, but the CPU is really good. It's a really good 6-core processor if you wanted to do some video editing on the side. So this CPU should be able to power the graphics card that I'm going to discuss later in the video. So the CPU fan, once again, is the exact same from the last build, so it's really not that great, but it should be able to cool your CPU pretty decently. So for the motherboard, I went with my personal favorite motherboard that I actually have right here, the MSI Z370A Pro motherboard. Now this motherboard I find really good. It's really good for overclocking actually, so if you wanted to upgrade from an i5-8400 up to like something like an 8600K or an i7-8700K, you totally could, and it would also be pretty decent for the price. Now this motherboard coming in at $101 isn't exactly cheap, but it's a pretty decent motherboard if you wanted to upgrade, and it gives you an awesome amount of features. It also has an M.2 slot, so if you wanted to put one of those in, you totally could. Now for memory, once again, I went with Patriot Viper 2400 MHz DDR4. Now once again, this is just 8GB of DDR4, but this RAM is pretty cheap, so if you wanted to upgrade to something like 16GB, you totally could for an extra $80. Now for storage, once again, I just went with another 2TB Seagate drive. It's really nothing special, but I have one of these drives and I'm actually pretty impressed with it. Now for the graphics card, I actually went with an 8GB RX 580 from ASUS. Now this card should allow you to play games at 1440p at medium to high settings, especially with the 8GB of VRAM. You could totally crank up textures in games to their highest settings, and it would also be a great card for editing videos because of the 8GB of memory. Now the other nice thing about this card is that with the Z370A Pro motherboard, it supports Crossfire, so if you wanted to buy another RX 580, you totally could and run them in Crossfire. And personally, I think that that would be pretty cool, and it would also be a pretty good deal, especially because the RX 580 is only going for $280. So for the case, once again, I just went with the COUGAR MX330, and for the power supply, I did the same thing as the last build, a Seasonic 520 watt power supply. So this PC coming in at $797 I think is a really good price, especially because you're getting 1440p performance and you're getting an i5-8400 CPU, which I personally think the i5-8400 is a really good CPU because of the 6 cores. It's coming in at about $180, so once again, this CPU really isn't cheap, and this entire build really isn't cheap, but it should let you get 1440p performance with some video editing on the side. So this next build is coming in at an incredibly expensive $1,492. So this build is not cheap by any means, and I really tried not to cheap out on very many parts when putting this build together. Mostly because for $1,500 you should be able to expect a really good CPU and a really good GPU and pretty much really good components in your entire PC. And this build is mostly focused on just gaming, not necessarily everything else that comes with having a computer. So moving on to the CPU, I chose an i7-7700K CPU, which is a quad-core processor clocked at 4.2 GHz. Now a lot of people might be saying, oh, why didn't you go with an i7-8700K or like a higher end i5-8600K? Well, the reason I chose the 7700K is actually because it's a really good gaming CPU. It still holds up very well compared to the i7-8700K, which is a 6-core 12-thread processor. Now the i7-7700K is still a quad-core processor, it's got 8 threads in it, but the nice thing about this CPU is that it was quite a bit cheaper than the i7-8700K, and you really don't lose much of the performance from the i7-8700K. So I personally found that for $313, this CPU is incredibly good for the price. Now to cool this bad boy, I wouldn't really recommend using an air cooler. So to cool this bad boy, I went with the Corsair H100i V2 liquid cooler. Now this radiator should be able to keep your CPU pretty decently cool. It should allow you for a little bit of overclocking, but not really that much, but it should keep it running cool and keep it running at 4.2 GHz. Now for the motherboard to pair with this thing, I went with an MSI Z270A Pro ATX motherboard. Now this motherboard is pretty similar to the Z370A Pro motherboard. It's one generation older, but it costs about the same as the Z370A Pro motherboard. So if you wanted to supplement like the i7-7700K with something like an i5-8600, you totally could, and it would really not cost that much more. In fact, it would actually be quite a bit cheaper. But this motherboard should let you overclock a little bit. Now for memory and RAM, I went with G-Skill Ripjaw V-Series. It's DDR4 clocked at 3200 MHz, and it is 16 GB. Now this is a 16 GB kit with 4 sticks of 4 GB, so it will allow you to run memory in quad channels, so that will actually improve your CPU performance quite a bit over dual channel. And with 16 GB of memory, it should let you do a little bit of video editing on the side, even though video editing isn't really the main focus of this computer. Now for storage, once again, I just went with a 2TB SEAGATE drive. Really nothing special, but it's cheap and allows you to have quite a bit of storage. So for the video card, I went with a GTX 1080 from GIGABYTE. Now the GTX 1080, not the 1080 Ti, but just the base 1080, is actually a really good all-around 4K card. Now is it as good as a 1080 Ti? No, not necessarily, but for the price of $565, this card will let you play games at 4K at 60 FPS on medium to high settings. Especially with 8GB of GDDR5 memory, it should let you crank up textures really high, and it should also let you run games at a really decent resolution and frame rate. Now for the case, I went with a PHANTEKS ECCLIPSE P400S tempered glass ATX tower case. Now this case, coming in at $85, is really expensive compared to the COUGAR case that I mentioned in the last two builds, but this case has tempered glass, and it also has quite a bit of expansion slots, and it has air filters. So if you're really OCD about getting dust in your case like I am, this case has got you covered. Now for the power supply, I went with something a little bit different. I went with an EVGA Supernova G3 750 watt power supply. Now this power supply has an 80+ gold rating, and it is also fully modular, so it really is kind of expandable, and if you wanted to buy another 1080 to run an SLI, you totally could with this power supply, even though it would be pushing it a little bit, but if you did want to run another 1080, you totally could. So this build coming in at $1,492, once again, isn't really cheap by any means or any stretch of the imagination, but this build is pretty much just an all-out build within a budget of $1,500. Now all of these builds, like I said, are once again, they're tiered, so the $650 build is meant to be a 1080p monster, the $800 build is meant to be a 1440p editing machine, and the $1,500 build that I just went over is meant to be a 4K monster. So once again, if you want to just see these computers or you want to just tinker with them, I will leave a link to them in the description below, so if you want to check them out, they will be in the description. And once again, if you want to talk to me personally or you want to talk to someone else about this stuff, there's a link in the description down in the Discord where you could get a hold of me personally or talk to someone else in the community that knows what they're talking about. So if you're not really sure about certain things or you're not really sure about these builds, I would personally join the Discord and talk to someone about them. So thank you for watching, and if you did enjoy this video, don't forget to click here for more videos. And if you want to join the Discord, the link will be in the description below, and if you want to just go and hang out and chill, we'll all be in there, and it's actually a pretty fun time just hanging out in the Discord. So thank you for watching, and if you want to stay up to date on all the latest tech news, don't forget to click here to subscribe. Don't forget to leave a like if you want to see more of these types of videos, and I will catch you in the next one.